When you picture a family freezing on the frontier, you picture an empty woodpile, nothing left to burn. But the families who froze in the hardest winters often had wood outside their doors. Green wood, wet wood, wood that hissed and smoked and refused to catch because the fire they had was already dying. The problem was not the pile. The problem was the flame. You could own a cord of oak and still watch your stove go cold if you could not make the first piece burn. In the winter of 1880, a widow on a logged-over ridge in Dakota understood this before anyone else did. Marit Brecka had not slept in the valley for 3 nights. The farm where her husband had built a table from split cottonwood, where her youngest had learned to walk between the stove and the flour barrel, where 11 months of widowhood had at least been warm. That farm belonged to Cassian Voss now. The papers said so. The deputy had said so. The mule, limping on a split left forehoof, said so every time it stumbled on the uphill grade toward the mountain claim that was the only ground left in the territory with her name attached to it. She was 32 years old. She had 2 children. She had $17.30 folded into a square of oilcloth inside her coat. She had an iron cook stove with a cracked side plate, 2 quilts, a hand axe, a pickaxe, and a cross-cut saw missing 1 handle. She had less than half a cord of punky scrap wood stacked against a cabin frame that did not yet have a finished roof, and she had roughly 6 weeks before the kind of cold that killed people who had done everything right. The mountain claim sat at the top of a ridge west of Rapid Creek, 16 by 18 feet of notched pine walls that her husband Amund had started raising the summer before the wagon accident. He had planned to finish it in autumn. He had planned many things. The walls stood 7 logs high on 3 sides, 5 on the 4th where a window was supposed to go. The roof was half covered with split shakes weighted down by stones. The chinking between the logs was mud and grass on the south wall, and nothing at all on the north. The door was a blanket nailed over a frame. Eli, 12 years old and already carrying himself like someone who understood that childhood had terms and conditions, dropped the rope handles of the drag sled and looked at the cabin without speaking. Ragna, 6, pressed against Marit's leg and asked if the fire was already going inside. It was not. The stove sat in the northeast corner where Amund had placed it, pipe rising through a tin collar in the roof that leaked daylight around the edges. The firebox was cold. The ash pan held 3 inches of white powder and mouse droppings. When Marit opened the side door, the cracked plate shifted and let a finger width of air through. She could see the wall behind it through the gap. She fed every scrap of dry bark she could strip from the drag sled's rails into the firebox and nursed a flame from her last 3 matches. The fire caught, smoked badly because the pipe was short and the draw was weak, and produced enough warmth to make Ragna stop shaking, but not enough to dry the quilts. That was the first evening on the ridge. There would be roughly 40 more before January. The settlement below, a loose scatter of cabins, a freight depot, a store, and a blacksmith's lean-to along the road west of Rapid Creek, had heard about Marit Brecka the way small places hear about everything, in fragments, through judgment. Amund Brecka had been a good worker and an optimistic borrower. He had leased the Valley Farm on credit extended by Voss, bought the mule and the stove on credit extended by Voss, and filed the mountain claim with the understanding that timber work would cover the payments. Then the loaded wagon tipped sideways on a washed-out grade, pinned him beneath 800 pounds of green pine, and the debts became Marit's. Voss had waited 11 months. That was not generosity. The Valley Farm produced enough garden yield and small trade that he collected partial payments through the growing season. When autumn came and the payments stopped because there was nothing left to sell, he filed the papers. The law allowed it. The settlement understood it. Even the deputy, Abel Strunk, who folded the eviction notice with unnecessary care before placing it in her hands, understood it. What no one understood was why Marit Brecka did not take her children east to Yankton or Sioux Falls, find a cousin or church, and let the mountain claim revert. That was the reasonable course. That was what women in her position did. She had no labor crew, no timber contract, no stored provisions beyond a quarter sack of flour and 9 pounds of salt pork, and no standing trees within easy hauling distance of the claim, because a mine timber company had clear-cut the near slope 3 years earlier. She could not leave because leaving required money she did not have for a journey she could not make with a lame mule and 2 children before the freight road closed for winter. She could not leave because abandoning the claim would allow Voss to petition for it, connecting it to his timber road, and the mountain ground was the last thing in Dakota Territory that bore the name Brecka. She could not leave because Amund was buried below the ridge in a grave she had dug herself, and leaving meant no one would know where he was by spring, so she stayed. And the arithmetic began. Orrin Pike arrived on the 4th morning. He was 61 years old, bow-legged from decades on horseback, and he had spent 9 years as a wood contractor supplying army posts in Wyoming and Montana before his knees sent him to a cabin near the creek. He knew firewood the way a banker knows currency, by weight, by species, by moisture, by the number of days it would keep a body above the temperature where blood thickened and thinking slowed. The settlement treated his judgment on fuel matters as something close to law. He did not come to help. He came to count. Pike walked the claim perimeter with Marit while Eli watched from the doorway. He paced off distances. He kicked at the scrap pile. He examined the cabin walls, pressed his thumb into the chinking mud, looked up at the gap where the roof shakes did not meet, and said nothing for a long time. Then he stopped beside the woodpile. "How much is here?" he asked. "I have not measured it," Marit said. Pike crouched and restacked 3 pieces, estimating volume by eye. "That is perhaps 1/3 of a cord, maybe less. The birch is punky, the pine is green. Half of it will smoke before it burns." He stood and pointed northeast, where the clear-cut slope showed nothing but stumps and brush for 200 yards in every direction. "Where is your timber?" "I do not have timber." "No," Pike said. "You do not." He paced off the dimensions of a proper cord, 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, in the dirt beside the cabin. The rectangle looked enormous next to her pile of crooked sticks. "That is 1 cord," he said. "You need 6 stacks dry before Christmas. 8 if the wind keeps at this ridge the way it did last year. You have 1/3 green and punky. The difference is not something a woman, a child, and a lame mule can haul from standing timber 2 miles down slope in the time you have left." He looked at her. His expression was not cruel. It was the expression of a man who had seen winter kill families who had started with more than Marit possessed. "Mrs. Brecka, that is not hardship. That is arithmetic." Marit did not answer immediately. She was looking past Pike at the field of stumps beyond the cabin. The timber company had taken every tree worth cutting and left the rest, a graveyard of sawn-off trunks, some waist-high, some level with the ground, all of them blackened and soft-looking after 3 years of weather. "What about those?" she asked. Pike followed her gaze. "Stumps," he said. "Rotten ones. You cannot burn rot. It smokes. It stinks, and it produces less heat than the effort it takes to chop it." He pulled his collar tighter. "I have said what I came to say. I am sorry about your husband. I am sorry about the farm, but sorry does not stack wood." He left. Marit stood in the yard and listened to his horse pick its way down the grade until the sound disappeared into the wind. She went inside. She fed the stove 3 sticks of the punky birch and watched it smoke. Ragna coughed. Eli asked if they were going to freeze. "No," Marit said. She did not know if it was true. That night she lay awake on the floor beside the stove while the children slept on the single bunk Amund had built into the south wall. The fire ticked and shifted. The wind pressed against the unchunked north wall and found every gap. She could feel it on her neck, on her ankles, on the side of her face closest to the door. She counted the sticks remaining in the firebox. She counted the sticks remaining in the pile outside. She divided the pile by the days until January and arrived at a number that was not enough. Pike's arithmetic was correct. She could feel its truth in the cold air moving through the cabin. She could also feel something else. A question she had not yet answered, pressing against the back of her mind like the resin pressing inside the rotten stumps she had barely glanced at. What if Pike was counting the wrong thing? 3 days later, Marit was digging behind the cabin, not for fuel, for space. The largest stump on the claim sat 8 feet from the north wall, and its root crown spread wide enough to block the path where she needed to build a lean-to for the mule and a windbreak for the stove wood. She swung the pickaxe into the rotten outer wood, and it crumbled like wet bread. Black fragments scattered across her boots. The smell was sour, old decay, wet earth, the sweet, sick odor of fungus working through dead pine. She swung again. The pickaxe bounced. She thought she had hit stone. The ridge was full of granite close to the surface, and she had already broken 2 fingernails prying rocks from the cabin floor. She scraped away the soft outer wood with the hand axe and exposed something that was not stone. It was wood, but not the wet, black, crumbling wood of the stump's exterior. This was amber-colored, hard enough to wring under the axe pole, and slick where the blade had shaved it. When she leaned close, the smell changed. Not rot, not fungus. Something sharp, almost sweet, like turpentine cut with orange peel. She split off a piece the size of her thumb. It was dense enough to feel heavy for its size, and the fresh surface gleamed with a faint oily sheen. She carried it inside and held it over the stove's single weak coal. The shaving caught fire before her fingers felt the heat. It flared orange and hot, burning with an intensity that had no business coming from a piece of wood pulled out of a rotten stump. She dropped it into the firebox. It landed on the coal, and the coal brightened. Within a minute, the 2 punky birch sticks beside it, the same sticks that had been smoking without catching for the past hour, began to crackle and flame. Marit stared at the fire. Then she went back outside, into the wind, to the stump. She remembered. Her father, Tollef Breke, in Norway, a shed behind their house, in the rain, water tapping the roof in no particular rhythm. He had taken a blackened pine root, ugly, soft on the outside, the kind of wood you would step over without thinking, and driven an iron wedge into its center. The rotten shell split and fell away. Inside was a core of golden wood that smelled like the shaving in her hand smelled now. Resin had bled down from the living tree into the roots and heartwood. When the tree died or was cut, the sapwood rotted, but the resin-soaked core hardened. It became denser. It became almost waterproof, and it burned like nothing else in the forest. He had held a curl of it to a coal and let her watch it catch. The flame had been almost invisible in the daylight, blue at the base, orange at the tip, fierce and steady. Dead pine is not always dead inside, he had told her. The heart holds the resin holds the fire. The outside rots, the inside hardens. You will never be cold if you know where to look. She had been 9 years old. She had not thought about that lesson in 23 years. It had lived in her body, in the memory of sticky fingers and the smell of turpentine, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Marit picked up the pickaxe and went back to work on the stump. She cleared away 2 armloads of rotten outer wood and exposed a core of resin-hardened heartwood the size of a nail keg. When she split it along the grain, each piece showed the same amber density, the same oily sheen, the same sharp smell. The logged-over slope was not empty. It was full of stumps, dozens of them, maybe more, each one cut 3 years ago and left to rot from the outside in. And inside each one, if the resin had concentrated the way her father's pine roots had concentrated, there might be heartwood hard enough to burn hot, catch fast, and ignite fuel that ordinary flame could not touch. She was not looking at a graveyard. She was looking at a vault, but she did not know how much was there. She did not know if every stump held resin or only some. She did not know if the heartwood would burn cleanly in a damaged stove with a short pipe and bad draw, or if the resin smoke would fill the cabin and choke her children. She did not know if the heat would be enough to warm a 16 by 18-foot cabin with gaps in the chinking and a roof that leaked. She knew one thing. The shaving had caught from a single coal, and the coal had been dying. She split off a dozen more pieces, carried them inside, and began to test. The testing took 3 days because Marit was methodical in the way her father had been methodical, not cautious by temperament, but cautious by experience. A mistake with fire in a half-finished cabin with 2 sleeping children was not a lesson. It was a funeral. She cut the heartwood into 3 sizes. Thin shavings curled with the hand axe for ignition, thumb-thick splints for kindling, and fist-sized knots for sustained heat. She tried each one separately, then in combination, tracking results by scratching marks on the wall beside the stove. The shavings were extraordinary. A single curl the length of her finger caught from a coal so weak she could hold her hand over it without flinching. The flame was immediate, orange hot, and it lasted long enough to dry and ignite a stick of damp pine slash that she had failed to light with bark tinder 3 times that morning. 2 shavings together produced a flame that could catch green wood if she fed it slowly and kept the draft open. The splints burned fiercely. 2 of them, crossed inside the firebox, produced enough heat to warm the iron within minutes. She could feel the temperature change on her face from 4 feet away. 4 splints brought the stove to a heat she had not felt since the Valley Farm, where they had burned seasoned cottonwood by the armload. The fist-sized knot was the problem. She buried it under the other wood and opened the stove door to give it air. It burned hot, too hot. The cracked side plate glowed along the fracture line, cherry red in the dim cabin, and smoke poured not just from the pipe, but from the crack itself, filling the cabin's north corner with a sharp, resinous haze that stung her eyes and made Ragna cough until she gagged. Eli grabbed his sister and pulled her toward the door. Marit yanked the blanket aside and pushed them both into the cold air. She pulled the knot out with the fire tongs and dropped it hissing into the snow outside. The cabin cleared slowly. The stove plate ticked as it cooled. A black stain of resin smoke marked the chinking above the crack. The knot lay in the snow, still burning. It melted a circle around itself and kept going, eating down into the frozen ground as if cold was an inconvenience it had chosen to ignore. The resin wood was powerful, but it was not simple. Used carelessly, it could crack the stove open, fill the cabin with smoke, or throw sparks through the gap in the side plate and catch a quilt on fire while they slept. Used carefully, in small pieces, as ignition and heat boosting for the poorer fuel she already had, it might be the difference between freezing and surviving. Might. Not certainly. She had proven it could start a fire. She had not proven it could sustain a winter. Nettie Harrow arrived the next afternoon. She was 38, the mother of 5 children ranging from 14 to 2, and she lived on a claim a quarter-mile downslope where her husband Garrett split rails and hunted. Nettie was not unkind. She was practical in the way that people who feed 7 mouths on uncertain income are practical. She could not afford to invest sympathy in ventures that would fail, because failure on the frontier was contagious. If Marit collapsed, someone would have to take the children. That someone would most likely be Nettie. She could not afford 2 more. She found Marit on her knees beside the big stump, splitting rotten wood away from the amber core with the hand axe. Black fragments covered Marit's skirt. Her hands were filthy, the blisters on her right palm cracked and weeping into the axe handle. She looked, Nettie thought, like a woman who had lost something in the dirt and refused to stop digging. "What are you doing?" Nettie asked. Cutting firewood, Marit said. Nettie looked at the pieces of heartwood lined up on a plank beside the stump. They were beautiful in a strange way, amber, dense, glowing where the low sun caught the resin, but they were small, a handful of sticks, a fraction of a cord. Marit, you cannot feed a stove with memories, rotten root smoke. Children need heat, not stories. These are not rotten, Marit said. She held up a shaving. Smell it. Nettie leaned forward and smelled it. Her nose wrinkled at the turpentine bite. That is pine pitch. It will burn, sure. It will also gum your stovepipe and smoke you blind. Not if you cut it thin and control the air. And how much of this do you have? How many slivers to fill a winter? You cannot shave your way through January. Marit pointed at the stump field. I do not know yet, but I know one shaving lit a fire from a dead coal this morning, and I know there are stumps on this slope that Pike did not count because he was counting cords. Nettie looked at the stumps. She looked at Marit's bleeding hands. She looked at the cabin with its blanket door and leaking roof. I will pray for your children, she said. She paused. And I will send Ella with lard for those hands before they go septic. She walked back down the slope. It was not approval. It was not belief. It was a woman making sure that when the failure came, at least the children would not have a mother whose hands had rotted off before Christmas. Marit did not blame her. Nettie was seeing what Pike had seen. A woman with no cordwood, no standing timber, and no labor, scratching in the dirt for scraps of resin-soaked pine. From the outside, it looked like desperation dressed as a plan. From the inside, it looked like the only option left. Word reached the settlement within days. Small places metabolize gossip the way stoves metabolize fuel, quickly, completely, and with visible smoke. The phrases traveled from Nettie's kitchen to the store counter to the freight depot and back. She has no cordwood. Pike told her plain. She's mining firewood out of dirt now. Next she'll try to milk a stump. Those children will be blue by New Year. Voss will own that ridge by thaw. A boy repeated the joke at the store, the one about milking stumps, within earshot of Eli, who had walked down to trade 2 rabbit pelts for salt. Eli hit him. The boy hit back. Eli came home with a split lip and no salt because he had dropped the pelts in the mud during the fight. Marit cleaned the cut with boiled water and said nothing about the fight. She said, "We will get salt tomorrow." Eli stared at the wall and did not answer. The gossip reached Cassian Voss, and he heard it with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching an investment mature on schedule. Voss was 46 years old, German-born, educated enough to keep ledgers and shrewd enough to keep them in his favor. He owned the store, held paper on half the claims within 10 miles, and had spent 3 years positioning himself to control the timber road that connected the ridge claims to the sawmill downriver. Marit's mountain claim sat directly in his path. Her husband's death had been unfortunate. Her eviction from the Valley Farm had been business. Her failure on the ridge would be profitable. He came to visit on a Tuesday. He rode a good horse up the grade, dismounted at the edge of the stump field, and walked the rest of the way to the cabin with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression arranged into something meant to look like concern. Marit was splitting heartwood behind the cabin. Eli was stacking the amber pieces under the lean-to frame, which was now 3 posts and a crossbeam. Not a shelter, just the bones of one. Ragna was inside, coughing. "Mrs. Brecka," Voss said. He removed his hat. "I heard about your difficulty." "I have several difficulties," Marit said. She did not stop splitting. "Which one interests you?" "The children," he said. "Winter is hard on children, without adequate provision. I've spoken with Mrs. Lundgren in town. She has a spare room. I'm prepared to cover the cost of housing your children through the cold months. In exchange, We would formalize a security interest against the remaining balance on the valley lease. Not a sale, a protection, for everyone. He let the word settle. He used protection the way a man uses a clean cloth over a wound to make the ugly thing underneath seem like care. Marit understood the mechanism. If she signed the conditional release and then failed to survive the winter, which Voss fully expected, the claim would transfer to him without the cost or delay of a formal petition. If she survived but could not pay, the security interest would mature into a lien. Either way, he would own the ridge, the timber road access, and the reputation of a man who had tried to save her children from a mother too stubborn to save them herself. A woman alone cannot outwork January, Mrs. Brekke, Voss said. The arithmetic is plain. Pike has said so. Mrs. Harrow has said so. Even your boy knows it. He fought a child over it yesterday. Marit set down the hand axe. She looked at him directly. Then it is fortunate I am not trying to outwork it, she said. Voss tilted his head. I do not follow. You do not need to, Marit said. My children stay with me. My claim stays with me. Your offer is noted and refused. Mrs. Breck. I said refused. Voss studied her for a moment. He looked at the small pile of amber heartwood under the lean-to frame. He looked at the black fragments of rotten stumps scattered across the yard. He did not recognize what he was seeing. To him it was debris, evidence of a woman losing her mind. I admire your spirit, he said. He put his hat on. I will make the same offer in December. The terms may be less generous. He rode back down the grade. The hoofbeats faded. The wind filled the silence he left behind. Eli came around the corner of the cabin. He had heard everything. His face was tight with something that 12-year-old boys are not supposed to carry, not anger, not fear, but the weight of understanding that the adults in his world were playing a game whose rules he could see but not change. He wants our land, Eli said. Yes. Are we going to lose it? Marit picked up the hand axe. Not today, she said. That was the most honest answer she could give, and the most dangerous promise, because today was easy. Today she had a stump to split and a fire to feed, and a boy who still believed his mother's hands could hold everything together. Tomorrow the snow would be deeper. The stumps would be harder to reach. The stove crack would be wider, and Voss would still be waiting at the bottom of the grade, patient as a creditor, warm as a man with someone else's firewood. The next morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Marit began mapping the stump field. She walked the entire slope with a long stick, poking each stump she passed. Most of the outer wood was soft, black, crumbling, worthless. But when she struck harder, driving the stick toward the center, some stumps resisted. The stick bounced back with a sound like tapping a drum. These stumps had cores. Others were rotted through. The stick sank to the ground without resistance, and pulling it out released a smell of wet earth and decay. She marked the resistant stumps with a scratch from the hand axe. 1 slash for a hard knock, 2 for a very hard knock. By midday, she had walked the full slope. She had found 14 stumps that resisted. They followed a rough line along the upper contour, where the biggest ponderosa pines had stood before the timber crew arrived. The old trees had been ancient. Their stumps were wide, waist-high in some cases, with root systems that spread underground like buried hands gripping the granite beneath the soil. Each stump was a gamble. The outer shell promised nothing. You had to dig, chop through layers of decay, endure the sour smell and the black muck under your fingernails before you could know whether the resin had concentrated inside or whether the whole thing was rot from bark to pith. The first stump she opened that morning, a low one, barely a foot above the dirt, held a core the size of a man's head. Hard, amber, reeking of turpentine. She split it into splints and shavings and filled half a flour sack. The effort took 2 hours. Her hands shook when she finished. The second stump was hollow. Nothing inside but wet punk and beetle galleries and a smell that made her eyes water. She had spent 40 minutes digging it out for nothing. She stood over it with the pickaxe hanging from her hands and felt the kind of tiredness that is not about muscles. It was about faith. Each empty stump subtracted something from the belief that the vault was real. The third stump was the largest she had tried. The sawn top was 3 feet across. The root crown had heaved the soil around it into a frozen mound that she had to chop through with the pickaxe before she could even reach the wood. It took most of the afternoon. Her palms blistered through the calluses she had built over months of widow's labor. The pickaxe handle rubbed a raw stripe across her right hand that cracked and bled into the grain of the wood. Nettie's daughter Ella had brought the lard, and Marit had rubbed it into her skin that morning. By noon it was gone, absorbed or wiped away by the work, and the cracks reopened. But when she finally exposed the core, it was bigger than anything she had found. A column of resinous heartwood that ran from the sawn top all the way down into the root crown, dense enough to ring when she struck it, wide enough that she could not wrap both hands around it. The resin had pooled here over decades, drawn down by gravity, concentrated by time, sealed by the hardening of the wood itself. It was not a handful of scraps. It was a pillar of fuel. She worked until dark. By the time Eli called her inside, she had cut 23 splints, 4 fist-sized knots, and enough shavings to fill 2 flour sacks. Her shoulders ached from the pickaxe. Her boots were caked with mud and rotten wood. Her hands looked like they belonged to someone who worked in a mine, cracked, blackened, bleeding at the knuckles. But the lean-to held more fuel than it had held that morning, and the morning fire had caught from 1 shaving and a dying coal. Snow came on the second week of work, not a blizzard, a quiet, steady fall that whitened the stump field and turned the ground to mud beneath it. The digging became harder. She had to scrape snow and mud away before she could start on each stump, and the wet cold stiffened her fingers until the axe felt like it weighed twice what it had the week before. Her breath hung in the air and froze on the wool scarf wrapped around her face. The mule watched her from its makeshift stall, 3 posts and a canvas drape that blocked the worst of the wind. Its hoof was healing but still tender, and hauling the larger root pieces was out of the question until it could bear weight on uneven ground. Everything Marit cut, she carried on her own back or dragged on the sled that Eli helped her pull after he returned from checking the rabbit snares each morning. She kept a tally scratched into the cabin wall near the stove. Each mark represented 1 prepared bundle, shavings plus splints plus 1 or 2 larger pieces wrapped in a strip of cloth, enough to start a fire from dead coals and keep it burning through 4 hours of damp slash and punky scrap. After 11 days of digging, 9 bundles, 4 more stumps opened. 2 of those held good resin. 2 were mostly hollow. Enough fuel for 9 mornings. Not enough for a winter, but the stove had not gone cold once since she started, and the cabin, for all its gaps and drafts, was warmer than the first night. Eli had chinked the worst of the north wall gaps with mud and pine needles, copying a technique he had watched his father use on the valley farm. Ragna's cough had eased. The rabbit snares produced 1 or 2 animals a week, enough for thin soup with the salt pork. Marit ate last and ate least. She could feel the weight coming off her ribs, the loosening of her dress at the waist, the way her arms tired faster each day, even as the work grew harder. The pickaxe that had felt manageable in the first week now sent pain up through her forearms and into her shoulders with every swing. She woke at night with her hands curled into claws, the tendons locked by cold and overuse, and had to flex them slowly against the quilt until they opened. She rose before dawn. She dug until her arms failed. She carried wood until her back seized. She shaved resin curls by lamplight while the children slept, the amber shavings piling up in the flour sack like the smallest currency in the world, each one worth a fire, each one worth an hour of warmth, each one pulled from the ground with hands that were running out of skin to crack. And she tried not to think about December, when the real cold would arrive and the ground would freeze too hard to dig, and whatever she had stockpiled would either be enough or it would not. The stumps did not care about her fear. They held what they held. The resin waited inside them the way fire waits inside a struck match, patient, indifferent, ready. She just had to get it out in time. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something everyone around you thought was foolish, only to realize they simply could not see what you saw yet? By the third week of November, Marit had opened 8 of the 14 marked stumps. 5 held resin cores. 3 were hollow or too far rotted to yield anything worth carrying. She had learned to predict, partly. The stumps with the widest bases, the ones that had been the oldest trees, tended to hold the densest heartwood. The smaller stumps, cut from younger pines, were more likely to be empty. But the prediction was not reliable. Every stump still required digging, chopping, and the particular kind of hope that exists when you swing a pickaxe at something that might be treasure or might be nothing. The tally on the cabin wall read 17 bundles, 17 mornings of guaranteed fire, 43 splints stacked under the lean-to, 6 flour sacks of shavings hung from pegs inside the cabin, high enough that a stray spark from the stove could not reach them. It was not enough. But it was more than Pike had said she would have, and the stove had not gone cold in 19 days. The problem was no longer whether the resin wood could start a fire. The problem was everything else. The stove crack had widened by a hair's width since the knot incident, and Marit had packed it with a paste of clay and ash that held for 2 days before cracking again. The stovepipe was too short, barely 4 feet above the roof line, and in anything more than a light wind, the draw reversed and pushed smoke back down into the cabin. The lean-to was half built. The north wall chinking was better than it had been, but still leaked cold air in 3 places she could not reach without a ladder she did not have. And the resin wood, for all its power, burned too hot and too fast when used alone. It needed ordinary wood to slow it down, to give the stove something to coast on between the fierce bursts of resin flame. The punky scrap pile was shrinking. She needed help she had not asked for and did not expect. It arrived on a Thursday, walking uphill with a limp. Sjur Vangen was 58 years old, Norwegian-born, lean in the way that men who have worked outdoors their entire lives are lean, not thin from hunger, but stripped of everything that was not muscle, tendon, and bone. He had spent 20 years burning charcoal in kilns across Minnesota and Wisconsin, and before that he had worked tar kilns in Norway, rendering pine resin into the black pitch that waterproofed boat hulls and sealed roof joints. He knew resinous wood the way Pike knew cordwood, by smell, by weight, by the sound it made when struck. He was passing through the settlement with a lame horse, heading west toward the mining camps where charcoal sold for good money if you could deliver it before the smelters ran short. His horse had thrown a shoe and come up lame on a stone bruise, and the blacksmith in the settlement had told him to rest the animal for a week. He was staying in the blacksmith's loft and eating meals he paid for with labor, mending harness, splitting kindling, carrying water. On that Thursday, he walked the ridge to stretch his bad knee, and because someone at the store had told him a woman on the mountain was digging up stumps. The man who told him had laughed. Sjur had not. He smelled the resin from 100 paces. He stopped on the trail and turned his face into the wind. The smell was faint but unmistakable, sharp, volatile, The same smell that had filled every tar kiln he had ever tended. It was the smell of concentrated pine heartwood exposed to air. He followed it. He found Marit on her knees beside the 9th stump, the pickaxe laid across her thighs, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth because the blisters had opened again. Amber splints were stacked on a plank beside her. Shavings filled a sack at her feet. The rotten outer wood lay in a ring around the stump, like the shed skin of something that had been hiding. Shure stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her work for a full minute before he spoke. He was not watching her the way Pike had watched, counting what she lacked. He was watching the way she handled the wood. The cuts were clean. The shavings were curled, not chipped. She separated the heartwood from the sapwood with care, setting aside the pieces that were not resin dense enough to be useful, rather than throwing everything in the same pile. "You are cutting it too honest," he said. Marit looked up. She had not heard him approach. Her hand went to the axe. "I am not a thief," Shure said. "I am a man with a lame horse who knows what that smell means." He nodded at the stump. "You're taking too much. Resin wood rewards a thief. Take only what burns cleanest. Leave the rest." "Who are you?" Marit asked. "Shure Vangen. I burned charcoal in Minnesota for 20 years. Before that, tar kilns in Hardanger." He stepped closer and picked up one of her splints. He held it to his nose, then tapped it against his thumbnail. The sound was glassy. "This is good wood. This is very good wood, but you are wasting half your effort on pieces that will smoke more than they burn." Marit's grip on the axe loosened. "Show me," she said. It was not a request for charity. It was the voice of someone who recognized competence and wanted to learn from it. Shure heard the difference. He had spent decades around men who asked for help because they were lazy, and men who asked for knowledge because they were serious. This woman was serious. He crouched beside the stump and took the hand axe. He tapped the exposed heartwood in 3 places. 2 produced the same glassy ring. The 3rd sounded duller, flatter. "Here," he said, pointing to the dull spot. "The resin did not reach this far. This piece will smoke. This piece will gum your pipe. This piece is firewood for someone who has a proper stove and a tall chimney. You do not. Leave it." He moved to the 2 good spots and shaved off a curl so thin it was nearly transparent. The shaving rolled into a tight spiral and gleamed with oil. "This is what you want," he said, "thin enough to see light through."